and welcome back to Vote 17. My name is Cameron Meads. This is a student-produced election series where we interview politicians each Friday in the lead up to the election. We want to know what issues matter to young voters, so to get involved, just like our Facebook page, Vote 17, and send us questions you'd like us to put to the politicians. Today I'm joined by my co-host, Esme Hall.
Thanks, Cam. Today we welcome New Zealand First List MP Tracey Martin, based in Warkworth. Welcome, Tracey. Thanks for coming down to Dunedin today for this interview.
Thanks for inviting me.
So before we get into some of those heavy questions, we just want to know why politics? What brought you here into your position in New Zealand First?
I accidentally ended up in this position for New Zealand First. So my mother was involved with New Zealand First right from its formation back in 1993. So I supported my mother, which is what you're supposed to do. So I put up hoardings and handed out flyers and so on and so forth. And then in 2008, she said, New Zealand First is looking for a candidate in Rodney. There was a couple of things that had annoyed me about our local representative, and I've never been backward in coming forward. So I said, yeah, I'll stand. 2008, we went out of Parliament, and I had the skills, the administrative skills to keep the party together with the Right Honourable Winston Peters and a number of other people, and ended up on number 2 on the party list in 2011 and came to Parliament.
So you obviously were drawn in and care about issues and care about politics, but you know, we're coming from a young people's perspective, and unfortunately we see that a lot of young people aren't engaging. So why should young people care about politics?
I couldn't say that I cared about politics. I cared about my community, and I cared about my country, and I cared about what was happening to my community because of changes happening in my country. So I personally didn't connect that to politics. And maybe that's what we're talking about with young people. How do we get young people to realise that the things that affect them every day, right from minimum wage to the quality of the air they breathe, can be dictated by politics? So maybe that's what we being society as a whole, not connecting well.
And we know that there's still around 225,000 young people who haven't enrolled to vote. Obviously that's just one way of connecting with Parliament, but why should young people be voting? Because everything that we do down there affects them. And I think the other thing too is, if you cast a vote against something, it's not as powerful as when you cast a vote for something. So what I say to young people is, find out what you value, what's important to you, look at the political parties to find out the person who represents what's important to you best, and then go and cast that vote for it. Never ever ever believe that your vote is wasted, because large political parties spend much more money trying to figure out why you didn't vote for them than why you did. And so let's talk a little bit more about New Zealand First.
Sure.
The last couple of weeks we've seen some quite dramatic leadership changes and shifts within different political parties. Do you think that's a prospect for New Zealand First in the upcoming future?
No.
No? Winston's there to stay?
Well, yeah, he's there to stay as long as he'll have us. You know, it's interesting. We've been criticised for not changing our leader, but you can see there's been quite a lot of criticism recently for people who keep changing their leader.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, I think for a lot of young people, we think of New Zealand First, we think of Winston Peters. That's the initial connection that's made. But you know, what does New Zealand First stand for? What are your values?
Well, there's 15 fundamental values that the party was based on. For me, the biggest one is about putting New Zealanders first. Now, people say, well, what does that mean? But let's talk about the TPP. Let's talk about the TPPA. The fact that that's a trade agreement, sure, but inside that trade agreement it has what is called the Investor States Disputes Clause, which means that New Zealanders may not be able to make their own laws, or they could be concerned that when they do, they might be sued by a very large international company. So that's about putting New Zealanders first. That's about saying we're going to put the rights of New Zealanders and their ability to make their own rules ahead of any other international trade agreement. That's principle number 1.
Cool. What emphasis does New Zealand First put on issues that affect young people?
Well, so most people don't realise this. Everybody goes on about New Zealand First and the gold card, right?
Yeah.
So that was a 2005 coalition agreement with the Labour Party. But the other thing that was in that coalition agreement was free medical visits for under 6-year-olds.
That was New Zealand First. It was originally pushing for under 13-year-olds, but we only got under 6-year-olds. But I wrote a policy that was launched last year. New Zealand First has always believed that students shouldn't have to borrow for their education. So we have what's called the upfront investment tertiary policy, where we would return to 100% funded university or post-secondary study for our students, and they would repay their country's investment by actually staying and working in New Zealand for the same number of years.
Yeah, so what are some other policies that would impact young people that New Zealand First are bringing to this election?
Probably the business-linked internship scheme, which is, so what that is, it's a pilot that I ran and walked with local businesses. So this is more for sort of rural or semi-rural youth, based off the Otago model, which is where we have business champions, post-secondary school students who have all achieved but aren't sure yet whether they want to go on to further study or what field of employment they want to go into. So we hook them up with a business champion. They gain industry-related credits while they're there. They have access to the universal student allowance for a 3 to 6 month period, sort of a try before you buy, before you make a decision on a pathway down that way.
So many of us students at the moment, I'm sure, are riddled in student debt.
Yeah.
We still probably want to travel at some point, and then we want to come back and hopefully own a home one day.
Yeah.
Do you think this expectation is unrealistic and at the moment, and what is New Zealand First going to do about it?
No, it's certainly not unrealistic. So
is it unrealistic under national?
Well, they don't happen to, it depends what you, okay, let's put it this way. The National Party believes that it is perfectly appropriate for young people of New Zealand to have 15 billion working towards $17 billion worth of student debt. And to have to pay that back with 12% of their incomes after tax. Now, if we just talk about house prices, that's one thing, but let's talk about the fact that after tax, every student, for the period of time they have to repay that debt, has another 12% taken from over a threshold. So it puts you another step behind. So what New Zealand First says is, first, you shouldn't have to have the debt, and for those who currently have the debt, we've got the dollar for dollar student repayment scheme. Stay here, work here, every dollar you pay, we will make sure another dollar gets written off. We've got the work in the regions for 5 years in areas of great shortage, and then the debt will be completely written off. And we're going to remove that arrest at the border, which was a Dickensian move brought in by the National Party just in the last few years. So those are some of the things that New Zealand First doesn't believe should be there in the first instance for our students. With regard to travel, and it's one of the first things that students ask me about on our upfront investment policy, if you study for 3 years, let's say you do leave secondary school, go straight to university and study for 3 years, so you'll be, let's say you're 20 or 21 by the time you finish a 3-year degree. Then you work in New Zealand for 3 years. So you're 24 and you're debt-free. Do what you like. Do you see what I mean? There's none of this just go away for a year or you're going to get interest on. And if you need to travel for your qualification, then we're based on the JET scheme, which has been working here for a large number of years, your, let's say it's the medical council, will find somebody of similar qualification to swap places with you for the period of time you're away, and their work will count towards paying off your debt, your skill debt.
Do you think, we know that it's less and less affordable for young people to live even when they're working and when they're studying. So do you think it is realistic to ask young people to stay in New Zealand when we know that cost of living is rising for them and they aren't going to be earning particularly much on those first jobs and might take them longer than 3 years to write off that student debt than we might anticipate?
Well, first of all, if you've only studied for 3 years, it won't take you longer to pay off your skill debt, because you studied for 3 years, you worked for 3 years, you studied for 5, you worked for 5. If we start getting above 5, I mean, you're talking about postgrad and so on, but you're also talking about medical students, and that's where some of that transfer of skills starts to come into play, all right? So they are able to travel and so on. If you're talking about, when you said just there, is it fair to ask young people to stay and work in New Zealand? If New Zealand has invested in you 100%, then I believe it's fair for you to have to invest your skills back into your country. At the moment, 70% of the investment right now is made by the New Zealand taxpayer, and 30% by the student. So I think I would just have to, our basic policy is that is that fair exchange. We'll invest in you, but you have to give your skills back to the country.
And so is that how New Zealand First sees the value of education? Because I think, we know that when there's that dollar figure on your degree, oftentimes it can be taken as, I'm going to pay this and then get this job. But does New Zealand First more see it as gaining skills in order to invest in our country and build into our country?
We see it more as actually just trying not to burden our next generation with $15 billion worth of debt.
Yeah.
It's not working. The system is not working. We've got a generation of young people, because I was a debt collector, right? So before I came to Parliament, I was 15 years as a stay-at-home mother, but prior to that, I was a credit controller, which is a fancy name for a debt collector. Debt eats at people. It sits on their shoulder and just holds them down. So the whole purpose of this policy is to try and remove the concept of debt. There would be nothing, there's nothing in our policy that says that if you're able to go and finance it and pay it back 100% as a dollar value, that you can't do that. It's just that we're going to stop spending $715 million per year on the administration of StudyLink and reinvest it into the young people in their education.
Okay, so let's talk about the election for a bit. Is it still a three-horse race that New Zealand First was claiming it was, let's say, before Jacinda Ardern came into the fray?
Yeah, well, we think it is. Probably even more so now with the latest poll around the Greens, because while Jacinda has managed to pull that support from the Greens, what was the MOU was probably looking fairly done, yeah? So for us, the goal has always been that three-horse race. It's always been to get into that place of major influence where the two big parties, we finally break the monopoly that they've had on, it's either Labour or National running the show, and they give a few crumbs to other people.
What are your voters voting for, though? Are they voting for New Zealand First to be the government, New Zealand First to be in government with Labour, or to be in government with National? What do New Zealand First vote? What are they actually voting for?
I think you'll find that there's a variety of people voting for a variety of those things. And this is one of the things that happens to any political party, particularly a minor one. And the Greens would have the same conversation, and probably so does the Māori Party again. I would say it's probably a big topic for their voters. Some of our voters will be hoping that we will go into government with National. Some of our voters will be hoping that we go into government with Labour, and some of our voters will be hoping that we don't need either of them and we run the joint. So that's what I love about New Zealand First. That's what I love about the caucus. It's not left and it's not right. It's a whole lot of New Zealanders with a whole lot of common values, just that are core values, and we just want some practical, reasonable outcomes for our country.
How do you make that decision, though? How is a voter going to, know with certainty where New Zealand First is going to lie if they vote for New Zealand First? Well,
you see, that's where it comes back to why are you voting. So if you're voting to try and actually control the outcome of an election, I would suggest it's not a great idea to vote. You should be voting on, I believe, this is how I vote, these are what I believe to be true, these are the things that are important to me, and this is the policy that party has that resonates with my values. So I don't vote on do I think I can get the outcome of a country or a party that I want. It's about what am I voting for on my values base. I'm not sure I explained that very clearly, but I don't strategize when I vote. I vote off my values. Yeah.
Okay.
Is that conversation one that has to be had after the election? Potential coalitions?
It can only be had after the election. You could talk it around and around and around as much as you like now. And obviously the Greens and Labour had a conversation about it, right? But from a New Zealand First perspective, what is the point? We don't know what the numbers are. We have to maintain our goal, and our goal is to get to the 23rd of September with the largest party vote we can get, to get the greatest amount of influence so that we're the strongest we can be at a negotiating table with whoever we end up being there with.
At that negotiating table, I know we're talking in hypotheticals here, but at the negotiating table, could you tell us what policies are just simply non-negotiable in terms of forming a government?
Immigration was going to be a non-negotiable. I mean, New Zealand First has been... not very. We can't... From the New Zealand First perspective, when you've got 72,000 net coming into your country, I think it's might have risen even more, and you've got your own citizens living in cars, your own citizens having a difficulty actually accessing healthcare, your own citizens under stress inside schools and other areas. And remember, this is all the people that are currently here. So what we're saying is that we need to turn that tap down to a level where we can catch up for all the citizens, whether they've been here for 1,000 years or whether they've been here for 4 years. All those citizens need to have access to a house, to a job with reasonable pay, to an education system and to a health system. So I would say it's very, very sort of inflexible around the immigration status,
I think from perhaps a younger perspective, you know, we often see this discussion around immigration and it's very focused on the immigrants coming in rather than the infrastructure coming up from our country. So how do you see that balance, and do you think it's fair to be focusing on turning the tap down, whether we should actually be focusing on turning the tap up on improving our infrastructure just generally?
Well, the two things have to happen at the same time. We have to catch up. So there has to be more investment in infrastructure because we've got people who are homeless now. We've got young people who can't afford to buy their own homes. We've got older citizens who are being rated out of their homes because the value of their houses has gone up to such a high level. We've got single women who are senior citizens who can't find a single unit that they can afford to go and live in, and yet they don't have enough money to be able to go into one of the flashy retirement villages. We've got a lot of issues that we need to deal with now on an infrastructure basis. You cannot continue to add to it to catch up. So it's not about, and again, anybody that is here legally is here legally. Nothing that New Zealand First has ever said anything about kicking people out who are here legally. We've always talked about the system. Our immigration policy is it's principle number 5, I believe, and it says, this country will always need immigration, but we refuse to use it as an excuse not to train, employ, and educate train, employ, and house our own people. And that's all we're talking about.
And so you recognise that there is a risk in this conversation for it to be focused too much on, you know, I'm speaking from a perspective of, we just see so much anti-immigration rhetoric around the world, and I don't think New Zealand, personally, I don't think New Zealand's a place for that, but there's a real risk in the conversation for it to be insensitive and not focused on.
Yeah, I agree, and that's what happens when people start to call each other names, right? And that's when you start to lose the conversation. And I think that's what we've seen in Brexit, and that's what we've seen in America. When people start to, instead of having a reasonable conversation and asking, what is your immigration policy, what does it actually stand for? But instead starting the conversation by saying, well, you're obviously a racist, you've shut down the conversation now. And that's the danger. My family is a New Zealand family. We're New Zealand Pākehā, we're New Zealand Māori, New Zealand Chinese, New Zealand Cook Island, New Zealand Iraqi refugee. So that's my family. That's New Zealand. And so none of our policies in New Zealand First, particularly around immigration, in my view, affect anything to do with the New Zealand family. It affects the New Zealand's future and their ability to deliver the services we believe and the standard of living we need to have for all our citizens.
So I think that brings us kind of into what New Zealand First's role in Parliament is, because I think when you place a vote, all the parties are showing their values, showing off their policies, but it's also really important to know how that party does operate in Parliament and how they have been operating for the last 3 years or so. So what do you see New Zealand First's role in Parliament being?
Well, at the moment we've been in opposition in this block that I've been in for 6 years, right? So there's a couple of roles in Parliament. First of all is to be part of what is the cross-party group that, the cross-party part of our Parliament that is its select committee. So we bring our perspective to every piece of legislation there through the conversation and collegial relationship that happens at select committee. Secondly, our job is to hold the government to account, to make sure that we scrutinise and ask questions to keep both sides honest, really, is what that's about. But lastly, for me, the only reason I'm there is to try and get the best outcome I can for New Zealanders. So in the last Parliament, I managed to work with every single party in the Parliament and unanimously got a bill through that would support orphans and unsupported children. This Parliament, I'm the Deputy Chair of Globe New Zealand. That's the first cross-party group to be working on climate change ever in this country. So that's another thing that New Zealand First brings, is it brings people who start to work with others to create cross-party outcomes as well.
And so one thing that we perhaps notice is that New Zealand First seems to call for a lot of referendums on different issues. So do you think and it seems that you believe that it should be the people deciding rather than a group of parliamentarians. I don't know, why is that?
Well, first of all, there's some things, they're quite big social shifts, you know, there's some stuff that makes quite a big difference to society. And let's take euthanasia as one that's a biggie at the moment, and also legalising recreational marijuana. Split that off from medicinal marijuana, because New Zealand First has already said that we support medicinal marijuana through a prescription regime. But if you take those two issues, those are issues that we think that New Zealanders have the right to discuss, and that my vote shouldn't be worth any more than your vote. I was a stay-at-home mother for 15 years. That doesn't make me any smarter than you. And so you need to have the same information I have, and then the country needs to vote.
So, but do you see that, you know, I have a vote and I vote in a parliament, surely that is my reflection of those people making decisions on my behalf?
Okay, so we have a representative democracy, and I would say that if every single bill that went through that House was a conscience vote, then you might be right. But you didn't vote me in there, did you?
I mean, this is my first election where I can vote.
Well, so you may. But this was not a topic, euthanasia was not a topic that anybody campaigned on at the last election. So how would you have been able to vote on the political party? If you have strong beliefs on that particular topic, how would you have been able to vote for a particular political party on that issue, which is a big issue for a nation? I mean, it's not the tweaking of a, it's not Uber. Do you know what I mean? It's a large piece of legislation that is going to make quite a substantial change to the country.
If parties were campaigning on it this election and setting out their values on the issue, which I think a lot of parties have been, it is coming into the discussion a bit more, and then I chose to vote on that issue, would it then be able for Parliament to make that decision rather than having to put it back to the people again who've just voted?
Well, I think, again, it would be fine if it was a representative democracy. So I'll take it back. Why did I stand in 2008? So Lockwood Smith was the electorate MP for Rodney, and there were two pieces of legislation that went through during the period of time that he was the representative. One was the anti-smacking bill, and the other was the prostitution law reform bill. He was asked by the majority of his constituents to vote against both those pieces of legislation. If he was their representative, surely that is what he should have voted. He did not. He voted with his party. So again, that's just what New Zealand First believes. There are particular issues that should be laid in front of the New Zealand people, and the New Zealand people as a whole should be able to have a discussion about them out in the open in a transparent way, and then a vote on them.
Is this a call for more direct democracy in New Zealand?
Well, basically, yes. I think that's principle number 15 of New Zealand First is about direct democracy. If we haven't campaigned on it, if we haven't had a position on it, on a big item, then it's something we think we need to go back to the constituency, which is the public. My also hope is that it might actually make young people feel connected to. So if I put a bill in front, and I don't think a referendum should just be a question. I think that's a really easy way to manipulate direct democracy, is to have a single question that is worded in a way that, well, how could you say no to it? Or how could you say yes to it? I believe that you have the same intelligence that anybody else sitting in that house has, and so you should see the piece of legislation, you should get the regulatory impact statement, you should get the full parliamentary blurb that we get, and then after 12 months, you should vote on it.
Well, one thing is that, obviously referendums can be a really blunt instrument, but we already have issues, enough issues engaging young people to vote in the general election. How are we going to get young people engaging if it is, okay, read this bill, tell us what you think, and are we going to see some groups speaking more in that instance than others, perhaps?
Well, I think it will depend on what the issue is. I think if it had been marriage equality, I think you would have seen a reasonable amount of interaction by young people. I think if I remember the copyright laws, when we were changing the copyright laws, young people got pretty active around that because they thought that their downloads would get cut off. So I think it depends on the issue. I can't guarantee it. We haven't tried it.
Referendums are pretty costly though, aren't they? Because National came under quite a bit of scrutiny for their flag referendum bill, which cost 26 million.
Yeah.
A lot of people thought that was a waste of money.
No, so did we.
Exactly. But aren't you guys championing more referendums? So won't that cost more money for the taxpayer?
The 26 million actually was really interesting because, first of all, where was it initiated from? So it was initiated by a Prime Minister. Nobody really asked for a change in the flag. Secondly, the process by which it ran through was somewhat costly. There was quite a lot of advertising and other things. We believe that cost could come back down. But if you run, in our view, you'd be running 2 or 3 items alongside each other. They'd be run by the Parliament, not by the political parties. And we don't think that the cost needed to be as high as 26 million, no. Democracy is expensive.
Yeah.
A dictatorship is much cheaper.
We'd love to talk about this all day, but unfortunately we're pretty close to running out of time. Okay. So one thing we do here at Vote 17 is ask our politicians a series of quick fire questions.
Sure.
So if you're ready.
Okay.
In Parliament, who's the person you most enjoy sharing the elevator with?
Catherine Delahunty.
Why is that?
Catherine and I work really closely on education together. What would
the conversation be, do you think?
It would be about education. It'd be about inclusive education at the moment, and probably Te Reo Māori. We have quite a lot of conversations about Te Reo Māori at the moment.
What's your most embarrassing moment as an MP?
As an MP? I don't know. I don't get embarrassed very easily, you know. You live in the moment.
Trait.
You live in the moment and you move on.
Probably quite necessary for an MP.
Favourite alcoholic beverage?
Pinot Noir. My husband makes Pinot Noir.
Oh, I was thinking single malt maybe.
No, I hate whiskey.
What's the funniest moment from your childhood?
I don't know. I remember standing on a beehive once, but that's not very funny. But that's the biggest moment of my childhood. Sorry.
Quite relevant. If you were a student here in Dunedin, what would the top thing on your Scarfie bucket list be?
What's a Scarfie?
Well.
One of us.
Just a student.
A student, yeah.
On a bucket list.
Yeah.
So, couch burning.
Oh no, I'm such a conservative. I'm sorry. I wouldn't. Maybe the Jaffa thing.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Yeah, maybe that.
And just to note, couch burning is actually against the code of conduct. So you'd be being a good University of Otago student.
Yeah.
What was your highlight of university?
I never went.
Okay.
No, I went straight to work. Yeah.
Well, good on you.
And it was free. Duh.
Yeah. Does Winston Peters really have Bill English's text?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. He doesn't. I'm not in that inner circle.
Why do New Zealand First MPs have flags on their seats at Parliament?
Oh, that was because that was about the flag referendum. But then so many tourists kept coming into Parliament and saying, who are the parties that sit, who are those guys that have the flag? So the ushers said, keep your flags up because it gives us something else to talk about to all the tourists.
And they're still there, aren't they?
They're still, well, we've actually just taken them because we didn't want to lose them, but yes, we will bring them back. We went and put them over on Bill English's and Stephen Joyce's desks just to say we're saving our spot. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us, Tracey. That's all we've got
Esme.
time for today. That's all for Vote 17 for this week. If you've got any questions for our politicians next week, make sure to send us a message over on our Facebook, which is just Vote 17, and give us a like while you're at it. And if you'd like to be in the live studio audience, head along to the OFAO building for next Friday. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Esme. Thanks, Cam.
Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you. That's great.
Thank you.